Tonight, we're honored to kick things off with Dr. Jeremy Manuele, also known as Dr. J. He's an orthodontist, educator, and the author of the book, The MARPE Advantage. And that's a resource that he's created that has helped countless providers deepen their understanding on the MARPE and different expansion techniques. And so, without further ado, I'll hand the floor over to Dr. J.
Awesome. Thanks, JP. And thanks for having me here. So kind of the history behind how this all got put together. So GetExpanded.org was actually introduced to me by patients. I saw it on one of the Facebook forums like, hey, well, if you're trying to find a provider, check out this website. And I use it all the time. And so, every day I have patients, asking me from different parts of the country, like, hey, do you know anybody in my area? Or hey, I live here, like, is there somebody that can help me, things like that. So just such a great resource, very appreciative as a provider to be able to network and join with other providers across the world in collaborating and really moving MARPE expansion and jaw expansion, midface expansion forward in general. So, we are going to talk a little bit about FME today, but I wanted to back up and talk a little bit about stability and retention. And then also some newer emerging technologies. When we talk about FME, I really want to dive into the quality of expansion because in my opinion, this is really the crux and really the main focus of why FME came into existence in the first place. They came onto the scene when there was already, MSEs and custom MARPEs. And so to invest so heavily in this, newer type of expansion, the real benefit was to get a higher quality of expansion, and we'll talk about what that actually means. Then we'll talk a little bit about where MARPE may be going as far as the integration of additional technologies and AIs and trends in areas of ongoing research. And then we'll call it a day. So one of the questions I always get is, well, after I get my jaw expanded, how stable is it? Like, is this going to last? Am I going to get my MARPE off? And then all of a sudden, is everything going to go back to where it was? And they've looked at quite a few studies and patient results to assess this and to figure this out. And what they are finding across the board is that, both the airflow changes and the skeletal changes are significantly greater in expansion compared to traditional types of expansion with MARPE expansion than compared to the traditional types of expansion that we used to have. And so purely bone supported rapid maxillary expansion is a significantly greater increase in nasal width at the anterior and posterior parts of the nasal cavity as well. So we're getting a higher quality result as far as the bone's moving, and it's more stable, which is not surprising to most of you on this call. I'm sure that's why you looked into this in the first place. So another, again, like long-term data, we don't have 20-year-old long-term data, but again, when we look at these patients, 2 years plus out of treatment, and we see both increases in the posterior nasal cavity with MARPE alone, and compare that to a traditional expander, we tend to see more increases in the anterior portion of the maxilla only. And so this is, again, one of those things, getting this quality of expansion, this split of the upper jaw from the front to the back, and then having that be stable. So this was the study that looked at that. Again, bone-born versus our traditional tooth-born. There's no real comparison when it comes to the quality of the bones moving, the predictability of them moving. This study was done on younger kids. And it was the first study to directly address this long-term difference between if you anchor to the bone when you expand or if you anchor to the teeth when you expand. This is another one that came out in 2023, but these patients were a little bit older. All right, so this is roughly a 14-year-old-ish age group, 13, 14. This talked about the width of the mid-palatal suture and at the levels of the molars compared again to traditional expanders. Same type of thing. And again, these were very primitive type of MARPE designs, basically just a traditional Hyrax modified to connect to a MARPE. And again, these growing or younger patients. And what they're doing is they're starting to look not only at the mid-palatal suture, which is, of course, what we are trying to separate to get the bones moving, but they're also starting to look at the other sutures. And this is really where the conversation about the type of MARPE that you use, whether it be MSE or custom MARPE, FME, whatever it might be, we have to have the discussion about, well, okay, A, does it work? Does it open the mid-palatal suture? Do we get the expansion? Is it parallel from anterior to posterior? And then B, what is it doing to the other sutures, where the maxilla connects to the other parts of the skull? And this is what we're going to go into in some detail. And so one of the biggest advances in this space, in my opinion, was understanding and learning what turning protocols have to do with the expansion itself. So when we look at these sutures, we've observed for a while that when we do a MARPE in a teenager, the expansion pattern seems to be better, seems to be more clean, seems to be more parallel. We tend to get less downward forward movement or reactionary movement away from the resistance than we do in adults. And so the question is always, well, why is that the case? Well, what we're starting to understand is that as we expand the upper jaw, in a growing patient, all of the circummaxillary sutures are naturally, or at that stage of growth, are designed to remodel. If that patient is growing, that's an active site essentially. And so there's not a lot of resistance in those areas. So when we start pushing the two halves of the bones apart, all of the other circummaxillary sutures tend to mold and adjust and bend quite easily. Well, it turns out in adults, it actually matters how we turn the expander. And if we turn the expander one way versus another way, or one speed versus another speed, we're going to get differences in how these circummaxillary sutures respond. Now, one thing we learned really early on is that if you turn the expander too fast, you can get these circummaxillary sutures to break. They will literally fracture, and you've probably seen that over the internet or Reddit or Discord or wherever, where patients had turned fast and they had some sort of fracture which caused some sort of facial asymmetry. Thankfully, those are almost non-existent nowadays with the protocols that we have, but this protocol is one, if you haven't heard about, it's definitely worth your time looking into. It's called force-controlled polycyclic turning. And what it means is essentially, instead of just turning your expander forward, you're going to go ahead and turn it forward, let it sit, and then turn it back. And you're going to do what I call stretching turns. And what that's doing is, in non-growing patients, it's essentially helping those circummaxillary sutures to become more flexible, more moldable, more remodelable. Because at the end of the day, if we want significant expansion at a high quality, if we want the expansion to look like we never had expansion and like our jaws just developed normally, and not like, some of you might have seen where the front part opens up so much, it almost starts to look, more primate in the front. If we want a higher quality, we have to have the entire maxillary complex and the midface, hence, Facegenics Midface Expander needs to expand along with it. So this is a video from my YouTube channel. If you're not aware of my channel, you can go over there, you can subscribe so you don't miss updates, but I'll post things like expansion turning protocols, and I'll place the literature articles in the description of the videos. And so if you want to go read the studies for yourself, you are welcome to do that. So here's kind of just a rudimentary diagram of all of those different sutures. And so you can see here where the maxilla connects to the nasal bone and the frontal bone and the zygoma. And then, of course, the pterygoid plates in the back. All of these areas have to remodel and have to be active in order for the midface to expand in a way that resembles natural growth. And so let's look at this last study on long-term follow-up. This was actually done with an MSc, and this was one of the groundbreaking studies in an older subset of patients, now about 20 years old. And they looked at the quality of expansion from a standpoint of how much is true what we call orthopedic expansion, meaning the bones themselves are moving or separating apart, and how much is just the teeth moving, or how much is just the bone surrounding the teeth or dentoalveolar, how much of that is happening. And what they found is that, close to 90%, and now with other studies, we're seeing, 90% plus of the movement of a well-designed custom MARPE, FME, MSE can be accomplished orthopedically, meaning the bone's moving, and only about 10% non-orthopedically. And then once we obtain that expansion, so let's say we get 10 millimeters of expansion, we're only losing about 10% of that. So only about 1 millimeter in that example would be lost post-treatment, which again is just really, really amazing when it comes to maxillary expansion. Traditional expansion, even if you got, 5 or 6 millimeters, initially you were going to lose some of that. And, compared to how much you're turning the expander, you might end up with, 60% at best bone movement. And then the older you got, the lower that percentage goes down, and it's more just the teeth moving and the bone bending. And so that's what they looked at. So now you can see, in addition to measuring just the maxilla, they're starting to measure, well, let's measure the cheekbones as well. Let's see, as this expansion carries upward in the face, how much are the other bones moving in these expander patients? And so you can see here, this I put in here because this is a great example of how inappropriate expansion can be carried out. So when we look at these cross sections of these jaws here, you can see that the upper arch is definitely broad. We can measure that out and we can say, look, this upper jaw is 11 millimeters wider than the lower jaw. But the challenging part is that this expansion was primarily dental, meaning the teeth tipping out, which you can see how far tipped out they are, and dentoalveolar. This is in a child, and you can see that the bones surrounding those teeth have moved. But if we looked at the before photo, you would see that there wasn't a lot of sutural expansion. And this is the danger, the challenge, the whatever you want to call it, of expanding with not enough force and or not enough anchorage, which means connecting to the bone. So in this case, it was basically just an orthodontic wire, similar to like an ALF, right? They had a wire on the inside of the palate, and they slowly moved it out, moved it out, moved it out, moved it out, and you can see this was the result. Which again, is it better? Maybe there's more room in the palate for sure, but did we get true orthopedic change here? Not really. And so these are the things that we're trying to avoid and overcome. And if we're not getting that true orthopedic change, we're going to be limited in the amount of airway benefit that we get. So you can see here, that's what that appliance looked like. And it was, activated and replaced, activated and replaced. This is when I first saw this patient when they wanted to be evaluated to see how the expansion had gone. And so again, just something to be aware of. There are different types of expansion. The better anchorage we have, the better quality of expansion that we have. So that's our premise. So where is this all going? All right, so we develop new technologies to gain a higher quality of expansion, but we also develop technologies to address or limit the shortcomings of the traditional methods that we have. And when MARPE first came on to the scene, there were lots of different possible complications that were going on. And so these are things that we needed to be addressing as new products were developed. So Facegenics came onto the scene a few years ago, and this was their original kind of design concept. They're saying, okay, well, let's design an expander that first of all doesn't rely on the teeth. And I just want to qualify this. Like, I don't speak for Facegenics. I'm not invested in Facegenics. I'm not connected to them in any way, except for a user. I use their product because I believe it is a great product for many patients. At this time, not for every patient, in my opinion, but for many patients. And I believe that they are invested in creating the most superior and highest quality expander on the market. That's what they want to do. And they continue to demonstrate that by the research and development that they continue to invest in as we move forward. So this is why I stay connected with them. So when it first came out, this was the idea. And if any of you have had an FME or seen patients online that have had FMEs, you'll realize that, with the current design, this is not really drawn to scale. It would be nice if a device this small, placed this posterior and this close to the palate, could produce what we need it to in the world of expansion. But just bear with me, we'll get through these diagrams, but I wanted to give you an idea of the process for those of you who may not be familiar with it. So the first thing that they did was created 3D custom jigs and a new system entirely. So they decided that they were going to anchor not the TADs directly to the palate alone like every other MARPE out there had done. They created a rigid, what they call anchor body, which are those two little pieces of metal there. And those anchor bodies are actually designed and placed off of the palate, and they are carried by this delivery jig, essentially. And so we have a piloting guide where we can pilot and prepare the sites for these TADs. And then we have a delivery jig where these anchor bodies are screwed into the jig. So this placement is precise. It's exactly off the palate to the extent that it's been planned in the initial planning. And when these TADs screw into these anchor bodies, not only are they screwing into the bone, but these TADs are actually threaded and accepted into the anchor body itself, creating a locked in or rigid system. And then once the anchorage is locked in or rigid, then the expander screw goes over top of it, and that's what completes the system and allows the force to be applied. So you can see here, we're going to go ahead, we're going to pilot, and we're going to use that jig to place the anchor bodies. Once the anchor bodies are in place, then we're going to place the FME on top of the anchor bodies. And now we have a system that's ready to be activated. And the idea is that these forces have to remain in the same plane as we designed them initially. So these additional anchorage rods or these guiding rods here are there to help as we expand to keep those forces parallel. So if there is play in that jack screw, if there's slop in the jack screw, like there is in most every other type of expander screw, then the more you expand and the further out you get on that expansion screw, the less rigid the system will become and the more flexible it will become, which makes the force transmission to the jaws via the TADs or whatever else it's anchored to less even. So that's why we can start to develop asymmetries. And that's why a lot of patients, if they start to develop asymmetries, you'll notice that if they keep turning, it gets worse and worse and worse. That's because the force system that created the asymmetry in the first place continues to get worse and worse and worse as the expander continues to flex more and more and more as you continue to turn. So the idea is let's have the most rigid system possible that can help those forces stay parallel throughout the entire process of expansion. And that's where Facegenics has gone. Now, this was one of the prototypes that I was privy to that they had shared with me earlier on. As you may know, if you've seen newer designs, they've moved away from this specific design. But again, this company is invested in making the best product possible. And so they have looked at all of the different options and how they can provide this anchorage and this rigid system in a way where the force does not decay and the forces continue to be even to produce the best and highest quality expansion possible. The other cool thing is that, and this is not unique to Facegenics, there are other systems out there that do this. I think MSE launched a similar system just last year, and custom MARPEs from some of the labs have launched a similar system. But regardless, this is a great system to be able to continue expansion after your initial round. So let's say you have a really narrow palate and you just couldn't fit that wide of a screw in it. Well, as you expand, maybe you max out this screw. Well, now you can replace the FME screw with a larger one, screw it back into the anchor bodies and continue that expansion process. And so that is all designed into the system there. This is one of the newer designs. I believe this is the FME 3.5, which is just one version away from the current version. And you can see they've already made some changes to this design. One of the things they realized in the initial design was that it wasn't rigid enough. And even having 4 screws locked down right on top of the anchor bodies, if you put enough force on it, it still has the ability to allow those anchor bodies to flex. And so they redesigned the housing that holds the FME, the actual screw portion of it, to make it more rigid. And they also included TADs outside of the TADs that go underneath the FME here. And so that is where that design went there. Now, this is from some of the data that Facegenics has published. And I believe JP and GetExpanded have access to this. I believe there's about 10 cases on there. We're not going to go through all of them. I'm going to go through the first case with you because I think there's some great talking points and things that we can understand and see how we are interpreting the data that we're seeing. All right, so these are some of the changes that we often see with skeletal expansion. So here you can see the superimposition, and if you're not familiar with these, the blue is the initial and the red is the final. So what's happening is the software is overlaying 2 of those CBCT skull scans, And it's showing the changes or the differences between those two. So anywhere that's red, you can see where the changes have happened all the way up to the cheekbones. You can see the separation of the mid-palatal suture here. And you can see an associated, there was possibly a little shift in the jaw from the beginning. Maybe the jaw shifted to the left a little bit between the scan. And maybe that patient just literally shifted their jaw, or maybe the jaw rotated a little bit downwards with the downward movement of the maxilla. That's where the 3D superimpositions come into play to see the actual movements, and I'll show you some of those later. But this is the idea. This is the goal. We want to expand, and we want to see not only the jaw widen, but if we're concerned about airway and breathing, we want to see the anatomy broaden. And we would love to see reduction of the turbinates and the soft tissues. This typically will occur with a shift to nasal breathing 100% of the time. As we breathe through our noses, we unlock nitric oxide that is produced in the sinuses and the nasal cavity, which is a vasodilator. And so it allows these passageways to open and allows the soft tissues to shrink. It's like Mother Nature's Afrin, but without the rebound effect. All right, so we want to see everything start to look better as far as the volume available, and we want to see the width of the internal nasal volume increase, as you can see here. And you can measure that. So you can say, okay, well, where did it start and where was it after expansion? Okay, well, we got a little over 2 millimeters of expansion at the piriform aperture, essentially. So that means that this nasal volume is increased. It's 2 millimeters wider here than it was there. How much is that going to help you breathe? How much is that going to reduce your AHI? How much is that going to allow you to feel like you can breathe through your nose? These are the questions that we are still trying to quantify. We want to ultimately be able to take this data and transmit it back to the problems and challenges that patients like yourselves are already experiencing, so that when we go down the road of palatal expansion, we can be more confident. Yes, we can make your jaw wider. Yes, we can help you breathe through your nose better. But what is that going to look like as it relates to your sleep specifically or your situation? That's the data that we're still collecting. So here's a view from below. You can see as the upper jaw widens, again, these jaw bones, the zygomas here, the cheekbones, actually broaden out as well. And this is the entire nasal passageway opening. And you can see those turbinates moving away from the septum and also the soft tissue shrinking. And again, we'll see that in a video here in just a minute. Okay. So now let's look at this patient. All right. So this patient had an FME 10, which you can see here. And this is the volumetric 3D superimposition. So you can see here, let me see if I can get that to play again for you. Okay, so here you can see that video playing again. So you can see this is the 3D superimposition video. So this literally shows where the patient started, and you can see that transformation of the bone between point 1 and point 2. Now, one of the things, if you're scrolling online and you're looking, one of the biggest concerns that I hear patients talk about is asymmetric expansion. So, hey, my left side expanded more than my right side, or the left side came forward, or the right side dropped down. And it's a big concern. And there's a number of reasons why that can happen. In my opinion, the most common reason for what I would call mild asymmetries, which is what most of them are, is related to the design of the expander and or the forces that the expander is able to transmit to the jaws itself. And so time after time, when we look at FME expansion patterns, we see this more consistent right to left pattern. We see the left span approximately the same as right large in the majority of patients, and we see a high quality from the anterior to the posterior. If you look back at the back, and let me see if I can show this without the video stopping, but these are the pterygoid plates as well. And this is an area that's had a lot of debates, a lot of surgeons, especially early on, made them. Yeah, so these pterygoid plates back here, this has been a topic of debate and discussion, because there's lots of practitioners out there, especially surgeons, that would say, hey, you cannot get high quality expansion without basically cutting these plates off so that the posterior part of the maxilla can expand as well. Well, when we see results like this, you can see that those pterygoid plates are moving right along with the rest of the maxilla. So what that tells us, and these aren't cut, they're not separate. You're not seeing the maxilla separate from the plates. You are seeing the plates move along with the maxilla. So what that tells us is that there is flexibility. With a force system that is properly designed, we can achieve true skeletal expansion, anterior and posterior, without having to do so many surgical cuts. And this is where I believe all of this is going. I think this is where Facegenics believes all of this is going, is that we want to design an expander so good and so precise that we can have predictable anterior posterior movement, hopefully without any surgery of any type at all. Between the design of the expander, the rigidity of the expander, the materials that we use, the location that it's placed, and the turning protocols, we hope to be able to provide the highest quality expansion. And I say we, meaning MARPE practitioners as a whole, and Facegenics as a company who is also interested in this. So this here shows some of the measurements that you can create from these 3D superimpositions. So we can literally look at any point, we can measure the distance between, the anterior portion of the maxilla, the posterior portion, the pterygoid plates. You can see the change in the upper and the lower jaw movement. You can see the lower jaw looks like it rotated downward about 2 millimeters. You can see the difference from the left side to the right side. And these superimpositions is what helps us to glean understanding about the quality of expansion and how the bones actually moved. Now you can see here as well, you can also look at the translation or the front to back movement of the jaw. And it's interesting because we have learned early on that when we expand, especially in non-growing patients, we do see a translation of the maxillary complex forward. And that is very counterintuitive to some patients because they often notice in their mouth that their teeth in the front tend to tip backwards. And they do, because when you stretch the front portion of the jaw, the teeth have elastic fibers which pull them, and it's kind of like the tent effect. So you basically pull the front teeth back, but at the same time, the maxilla itself is translating forward, like you can see here. We did a deep dive into this on the FME video I did with jaw hacks. And so you can check out the FME Dr. Manuele video with jaw hacks if you want to do a deeper dive into that. But just know that as the expansion happens, the jaw does tend to move downward and forward to some extent, and that's all quantifiable. So here you can see that video showing the literal translation of the FME, which obviously the FME itself is not moving, but rather the maxilla is translating as that's happening. And you can also see, this is what I wanted to point out to you in this video here. If you look at where the nasal bone connects to the frontal bone up here, look at the translation, the disjunction of this suture. Now, this is not a complication. This is not a fracture. If you look on both sides, you're going to see this. And so what's happened is the forces were applied to this skull in such a way that this suture was able to disjoin and remodel. And so with that, it was able to translate and move. And we're going to talk a lot more about the possibilities with this forward movement in just a minute. So these are the types of 3D superimposition I do for patients around the world every single day. And so if you go to my website, vegasorthodoc.com, you can do a video consultation, which is essentially one of two things. Maybe you are a patient who is in expansion, and you are curious to know, like, what is the quality of my expansion? How much of my expansion has been my teeth moving versus my bones moving? Have I had front to back movement of the upper jaws? Do I have any complications? Have I had a fracture? I felt a pop here, a pop there. Or maybe you're just wondering, am I even a candidate for an expander? Or am I a candidate for an FME? Or how should I decide between an FME and a custom MARPE or an MSE or any of the other options that are out there? So we walk patients through this every single day. So if that's something that you're interested in, you can go ahead and check out the website. You basically go online and you can submit your records through the website, and then we'll review them together. So if we can have disjunction of the maxillary sutures, then it would make sense that if we put an appropriate force on those sutures, a high enough force for enough time, then potentially we could get forward movement of the upper jaw. Now, we have known about protraction for a very, very long time. And one of the challenges of traditional protraction is that the anchorage is usually mounted to the lower jaw itself. So a traditional protraction face mask One pad goes on the forehead, one pad goes on the lower jaw, and then there's rubber bands that attach to whatever expander you're attached to bring the upper jaw forward. Now, until recently, there has really not been any convincing data that we can get significant maxillary protraction without some type of surgery in the maxillary jaw. Now, we know that the more we expand, because the resistance of the maxilla, resistance meaning where it attaches to the rest of the skull, it attaches higher and it attaches more posterior or toward the back. So as we expand, there's going to be a natural movement of the upper jaw itself downward and forward away from that resistance. So we've known for a long time we can quote unquote protract the maxilla by expanding more. And the more we turn the expander, the further forward and the further down the maxilla is going to come. But that's not really true maxillary protraction. That's just expansion that results in forward movement of the jaw. So when we're talking about protraction, we're talking about, a situation where you don't have to expand the jaw at all. You could perhaps maybe just open and close an expander to mobilize the rest of the sutures in the skull and then place a protraction force on those devices and the expander itself to actually translate the jaw forward in the absence of expansion of the jaw, and or if you are expanding, to bring the upper jaw forward more than you would if you weren't just expanding alone. Now, these are really the only devices out there that I'm aware of besides what we're going to talk about next, which we get a lot of questions about, which is FMA. So the crane was developed, again, to try and keep the pressure off of the lower jaw. So they essentially anchored to the neck and shoulders. This is called the bow. It was developed, again, to try to keep the pressure off of the lower jaw. This is primarily used in children. And this is a Grumman's, but this puts the pressure on the zygoma or the cheekbones, which, again, we know are moving as well. So that's not an ideal anchor point as well. And since most patients don't want 6 screws drilled into their head, Facegenics saw an opportunity to improve this. And so this was kind of cool. So if you're not familiar with GetExpanded, and I truthfully wasn't, I actually found this today, which is pretty cool. They have a series of blog posts on different topics. And so they had posted some of the rudimentary, I don't even know where you guys got this truthfully, but it's kind of cool. So this design process that Facegenics went through, and again, I was not part of this at all. Like I say, I'm not like, one of the founding members or part of their design team or anything. I just give them feedback on the products that I use. But you can see some of the designs that they had. They're saying, okay, well, if we can anchor to the body as a whole and the head as a whole, well, that would allow us to produce a much higher level of force than we have ever been able to produce on the upper jaw itself. So this is truly a new area. We do not know a lot about what that means, what it can produce. What are the side effects? What are the risks? All of these things are being worked out right now, and that's why FMA is not commercially available. Pretty much it's docs out there who are using Facegenics who have access to do this on themselves if they want to be their own guinea pig. So this is what some of the prototyping looks like. And for those of you who are super duper FME followers, you'll know that the most recent design of the FME is a 4.5 10P, which has 2 little inserts in the back of the FME itself. You can see where these nubs actually go into the back of the FME, and this is 3D designed, custom. And in addition to providing a force on these TADs, it also has the ability to adapt to the expansion. So these bars can widen as the expander is turned. And you can see here that entire force system is translated to essentially the entire torso and then stabilized. And so this allows an entirely new force delivery. Produce enough force, and B, can you get a patient to with it long enough to actually have significant movement of the upper jaw? And what is the requirement? So how much force do you need? Can you wear it just at night? Do you have to wear it 24/7? Are people wearing this to work? I didn't think it was going to be practical. But after seeing some of these initial patients who have tried it, the translation of the maxilla forward is unlike anything I have ever seen non-surgically. So I am bullish on this technology. Again, there's a lot of unknown factors with it. There's a lot of research that still needs to be done. But I love that there are, well, at least one company invested in moving this process forward and really advancing our profession as a whole. So where does all this go? So artificial intelligence. Honestly, I think that AI is going to be one of the biggest game changers in maxillary expansion that we have ever seen, and it is just barely getting started. There are so many things that can be calculated via AI that if we had predictable ways to calculate, could make our expansion so much more predictable. Things like bone density, the TAD selection sites, where they should be placed, 3D superimposition, and more importantly, interpretation of that data on a mass scale. You know, taking thousands of CBCTs from various patients and feeding it the data of how many turns were done and what type of expander were used. You know, AI can filter through that so quickly and give us meaningful insights. 3D metal printing, stronger metals, lower profiles, maxillary protraction. You know, this is going to be a huge area that, you know, I haven't seen much developed yet, but seeing AI work in other areas, this has to be where that's going. And also, you know, we want to have data-driven procedures and techniques. We will see the long-term follow-up. We want the 10-year studies. We want the 15-year studies. We want the studies on expansion in OSA. HI increased. Why did it increase? You know, we need to understand what's happening as it relates to sleep, especially. And then, of course, like the implementation of MARPE for more than just your traditional expansion patient. But can we start to correct craniofacial abnormalities in patients that used to require significant surgery? Can we mobilize sutures that are fused by using different protocols? That's where all this is going. So how can you get involved? So one way you can get involved is if you have relationships with your local providers, make sure they're educated. So I created an online course for providers to understand maxillary expansion. It's called MARPE 360. We talk about MSEs, we talk about custom MARPEs, we talk about FMEs, and we talk about the differences in expansion, and we talk about the techniques involved. We talk about the airway physiology and understand how it does change, how the nasal breathing changes, and how everything we do in orthodontics relates back to sleep and airway health. And so if you have relationships with those providers, let them know about this resource. It's one of the only comprehensive MARPE courses online available. And if they haven't been exposed to this, it's a whole world that if we get more people involved with, we will have a better chance of moving this technology forward, which is a benefit for us as providers and mostly is a benefit for you as patients to have more access to care and probably most importantly, get the highest quality of care possible. So that is it for today. Let's go ahead and turn it back over to JP and we can answer some questions.
So first question we have here from Dave. He's asking, how does the FME work post double jaw surgery, and are there any risks to it?
Yeah. So this is a great question that I get all the time, and not only the FME specifically, but even just MARPE expansion in general. So, you know, the first question we have to ask is, what is the difference between a patient who has had surgery versus a patient who has not? Okay. So one of the most important factors, in my opinion, is what type of surgery was done to the upper jaw specifically. So if you have had a maxillary split of the upper jaw, maybe a 2-piece, maybe a 3-piece, maybe a 4-piece, if the upper jaw has been divided surgically, then there's going to be less predictability in how that maxilla will expand. So if you had a 2-piece right down the middle, all right, well, if you expand with an FME, with a custom MARPE, whatever you use, and you do some sort of a midline cut or osteotomy, it should expand, you know, right down the middle again. Now, if you had a 4-piece MARPE and the cuts are different places, well, if you just were to place an expander and not do any cuts, it becomes unpredictable what parts of the maxilla are going to fracture or reopen, and it's going to depend on which is the weakest. Healing is dynamic, and it doesn't always happen the same way in every patient. So the first thing is, did you have the maxilla cut at all? So normally, a suture that has not ever been cut is not truly fused together. it's interwoven, meaning that there's little fragments of bone that are interconnected. It's almost like a puzzle piece, but it's not truly fused. Like if you looked at a microscopic level, you would just see it's interlocked. And that's a really important distinction to make, because when it's interlocked, as you place force on it, these little areas that are interlocked tend to open up quite easily and quite predictably. It's the area of the least resistance, and so that is where the upper jaw opens. Even if you've had a cut down the middle, whether it was jaw surgery, or maybe it was just like a piezotome or a piezo osteotomy where they did a cut down the middle, maybe it was an ease procedure. If you've had any procedure that actually cuts the midline of the palate, and then for whatever reason that heals up before you can expand, well, now you do not have a natural suture in place. You actually have bone that is scarred or fused or healed together. Now you have essentially one solid piece of bone wherever those cuts were made. So if you go to expand after that, it can become unpredictable where that will break, because now you have a healed area, which is like solid bone. And of course, the rest of the maxilla is solid bone. So unless you go back in and surgically release that area where you want the maxilla to separate, it can become unpredictable and you can have an unwanted fracture. So that's part one of your question. Part two of your question is, we have to understand, well, what else is different about a patient who's had surgery? Okay, well, if you've had surgery, you likely have plates that were placed on your upper jaw. So the question becomes, what do the plates look like? How big are they? How much of the maxilla do they connect to? So the design of surgical plates is quite different. There are some plates that literally translate across the suture and are attached from one side to the other with custom plates. Now, obviously, if you have a surgical plate that's connected from the right to left side, I don't care how much force you put on it with an FME or whatever you want to use, you're not going to be opening up the palate significantly, and you're basically just going to be shoving those tads, through bone, because there's, a plate with 10 screws that are keeping you from expanding. But if you have a plate on each side, then the only difference is that the plate is stronger than the bone would be otherwise. All right, it's titanium instead of bone. And the plate is not going to flex or bend. All right. So when we do expansion, we are counting on the bone itself bending in addition to translating to some extent. Now, the good news here is that the amount of bending appears to be much less significant than the changes in the circummaxillary suture and the translation or mobilization of the upper jaw. So to answer your question, can I get an FME post-surgery? The answer is yes, or a custom MARPE or any type of MARPE that's well designed. You can get a split of the upper jaw. You need to consider whether or not it makes sense for you to do an osteotomy down the midline. And you also need to consider like where the plates are. Are they going to interfere with the expansion process, or can we get the desired outcome with having them in place still? So those are that's the conversation you're going to want to have with your doctor. And the other challenge with surgical MARPE post-surgical patients is there really isn't a lot of data out there. There's probably, if I had to guess, probably less than 100 patients that have had some type of MARPE post double jaw surgery. And so the data that we have across all the practitioners is quite limited. And so the more data we get, again, an AI might help with this. If we can, have it screen our software, pull out the relevant data and pull out these patients in all the practices across the world, we could collaborate in a way that's super meaningful in getting more data about that type of treatment specifically. Great question.
Next question we have here from Madamis. He's wondering, he says, to what degree can one expect an increase in nasal aperture in relation to the increase in expansion of the palate? Is it one-to-one?
Yeah, it is not one-to-one. Yeah, so that's a great question. So let me jump back to, let's see. Yeah. So when we look at the nasal aperture, and I don't have an exactly front-on view. So basically, the nasal aperture is going to be obviously connected to the anterior portion of the maxilla here. So if you're saying like, what is, with how much the anterior portion of the maxilla expands compared to how much the nasal aperture opens, it's very close. But if you look at how much the expander screw itself opened or mobilized compared to the change in the mid-palatal suture, which again is going to be more in the anterior than the posterior, compared to the change in the nasal cavity volume, you'll see that there's differences. Let me see, did I post any in this slide? Okay, here you go. Yeah. So you can see here, this is obviously not the nasal aperture, but the same idea, but just a little bit further back. You can see that even, this area here opened up a little bit more down here than it did up here. This was actually kind of an interesting finding to me. And again, this speaks to the what we don't know about expansion yet. Like I would expect the further up we go with the expander, the less expansion to occur. Like this makes sense to me. We see the most movement down here at the level of the bone itself, 2.6 millimeters. And then we see a little less movement at the level of the nasal cavity and the nasal width here. And then as we go up, we see a little less movement. That's what we traditionally see, or what we call a triangular pattern of expansion, which of course is much, much less than, the actual movement of the two halves of the expander itself, which is totaling almost 8 millimeters. So that's what we typically see. So to answer your question, it is very close to one when you look at the distance that the anterior maxilla moved here. But when you compare it to what the inferior portion of the maxilla moved down here, or the screw itself, it is not 1-to-1. It can be, like I say, here it's a little bit over a half, right? And here it's more a little more over a half than that. What else is interesting here is that although this expansion wasn't perfectly symmetric, for as asymmetric as the screw was, in this case, the screw expansion, you can see this part of the screw moved much more than this part of the screw. The actual movement of the bones was much, much closer, within a half a millimeter or so of each other. So yeah, another great question.
Dave is also asking, are there any actual standards for nasal aperture and intermolar width? He feels that the norms are kind of all over the place.
Yeah, I would say I have not seen an established public or published standard of care when it comes to nasal aperture. So nasal aperture is primarily something that the surgeon is going to talk to you about, and the nasal aperture, the idea is, the wider the nasal aperture, the easier it is for air to enter the nose and the nasal cavity itself. So yes, there are norms for how wide the nasal aperture normally is, but does that always translate to how wide the upper jaw is? No, there's variability. There's variability in everyone's anatomy. And like how much increase in nasal aperture should we get with expansion? Those are questions that still need to be answered. And what type of expander will produce, more nasal aperture change versus less, those are also questions that still need to be answered. And no, there's not a published accepted guideline, to my knowledge, that would give us something to go off when it comes to that. So we essentially, get the highest quality of expansion we can, and then we measure it and we see what we got, and we pair that with subjectively what the patient is experiencing and their improvements in breathing and sleep.
A question from Scolopendra. He's asking, the FME 4.5 title implies that it's transitional in nature, or is it a work in progress? He's asking, are you able to share any details of the future of the FME design?
So I mean, I'm able to share with you what I know, is that even FME 4.5, yes, it's a version, but there's been at least more than one version of the FME 4.5. So they continue to modify the expander and improve the deficiencies. So I believe that the newest version of FME 4.5 will actually be here this month. And so, right now, if you were to go try to order an FME 10TAD 4.5, they are out of stock, right? Because they're waiting on the latest version to arrive. And so, yes, it is transitional in nature. They have not, publicly released. And this is something that is really unique, and it's a great question. When will Facegenics actually release their product? I mean, really, there's a select handful of providers across the country that A, even know about them, or B, place or use them. they haven't marketed to docs as a whole. Patients like you guys, you have your ways of finding out about it. But this is kind of, one of the secret areas of orthodontics that a lot of people just don't know about. So my opinion is that once they get an expander that they feel like is void of, I don't know, whatever percentage of the deficits that they see, maybe it's 95+%, 99%, then they'll scale. But I love the way that they're doing it because they are spending the time front in the research and development. So, I mean, ideally they have the least amount of problems, of course, when they scale, but they really do have ideally the best product available. And they're charging a premium for it. So, I mean, good for them, right? That's what this country's all about, right? I mean, you make a superior product, you add value, and you're compensated for it. So, I mean, we'll see. I mean, so far, uh, there's a lot of interest in this, and we're seeing results that we haven't seen with other expander types. And so again, I continue to follow this. I don't know what's, maybe there's other companies, looking. I have no idea where this all goes. I don't know when Facegenics settles on a final design, and scales it. But for now, I'm glad to be part of the journey. I'm glad to be able to offer something that can help patients, especially interested in the highest quality of expansion possible and the most parallel. And now with FMA, potentially the most non-surgical protraction that I've ever seen. So yeah, great question.
Dave is asking, is there any data on expansion relapse post MARPE/FME expansion, and what factors influence it?
Yeah. So long story short, we're seeing roughly 10% relapse from the time the expander is removed on a well-designed either FME, custom MARPE, or truthfully a well-designed MSE as well. And so it's pretty insignificant. Now, as far as how long do we need to keep it on in order to get that 10% or less, currently my protocol is 5 months after the last turn. So, after you're done turning the expander in non-growing patients, I keep that expander in place for 5 months. If we notice or see any changes during that time, then you can actually continue to turn and then just wait a little bit longer to take it off. And so it is dynamic. It's not, every patient is not the same. And so that's something to consider as well. But basically, if you do that, at most you're looking at right around 10% skeletal relapse afterwards. So let's just say you want to expand orthopedically to the tune of 5 millimeters. Well, maybe you expand it to 5.5. If you really want to push, you go to 6 millimeters, knowing that you're going to lose about a 0.5 millimeter once the expander comes off. As far as retention rates from FME to MSE to, I mean, like, really, I don't see a huge difference. I would, it's going to be related to your anchorage, right? So if you have failure of your anchorage, then you will have relapse of your skeletal expansion. Now, the good news is if you have a 10 TAD FME, even if one or two of those TADs quote unquote fails or becomes loose, right? As soon as it's loose, its anchorage value is very much diminished because it's kind of now surrounded by soft tissue, not surrounded by bone, as the body starts to kind of push that TAD out, if that makes sense. So if you only have two TADs, like some of those very rudimentary designs we looked at the beginning, then you're in trouble, because if you lose one side, well, now all of a sudden that side is relapsing. Really, both sides are relapsing. The expander's digging in the soft tissue, and you're going to get a lot of relapse. If you have four TADs, well, maybe you'll be fine as long as one on each side holds up. But that's why I really like pretty much any non-growing patient is going to have at least 6 TADs. A, for the predictability of getting the expansion in the first place, and B, for the retention value, meaning that if we have a late failure of a TAD for whatever reason, that we still have plenty of TADs to hold the bones in place, giving them time to heal up before removing them. That's a really good question. And I think that as we move forward, we will get better data as far as the exact amount of time we need to hold that there to produce the best amount of retention. But truthfully, I mean, people want to get their expander off as soon as they can. I mean, obviously, if you could take it off 1 month after the turns, I mean, we would love that. But we know that the expansion or the relapse rate will be higher in situations like that.
Second question in regards to how many hours of protracting and amount of force that's necessary.
And this is the truth is I don't know. And I don't think anybody knows because we've never been able to predictably protract the maxilla, right? Except for like if you're talking like like basically bony cuts, surgical plates installed, like osteogenesis via actual cuts in the maxilla. We haven't been able to predictably protract the maxilla. So how many hours is it going to take? We don't know. In growing patients, we know that we can protract the maxilla with just sleeping time hours. We know that if they wear every single night some sort of protraction face mask, that we will see noticeable changes of the upper jaw forward. And we know that the more they wear it, the more changes we will see. So that is to be determined. And really, FMA is the only place that we're getting significant data on this. And so, how much force, do you need? How long does that force need to be applied? These are questions I'm asking. And I want to know. So yeah, as soon as I get the answer, I'll share it with you. But truthfully, I do not know. There is, I'm sure, a number, and I'm sure that it's variable, right? Because everybody has a difference in their resistance, in their skeletal resistance. What I can tell you, what I would opine, is that the more mobile the sutures are, and I think that the turning protocols have a lot to do with that. That back and forth, stretching turns, 3, 4, 5, 6 turns forward, let it sit for 15 minutes, 3, 4, 5, 6 turns back. Keeping those circummaxillary sutures mobile is going to be a big factor in A, helping the protraction happen at all, and or B, seeing significant protraction without having to have it on, 22 hours a day. So hopefully we get to the point where we can just wear this at night when we sleep, or maybe in the evenings, in the mornings, maybe let's just say an 8 to 12-hour period, and we can predictably get the upper jaw to move forward. That would be a huge game changer. In the preliminary patient that I saw that had FMA, I mean, they didn't measure out in the images I saw the exact number of maxillary protraction. If I had to guess, it's close to 6, 8 millimeters. I mean, it was unlike anything I'd ever seen, to the point where, you might need a lower jaw surgery just to get the lower jaw to fit again with where the maxilla was, which again, I've never seen anything like that before.
We have a question here from Early Hemisphere. He's asking, do you aim for the same amount of anterior palatal expansion versus posterior if you're expanding to a moderate high degree? And what would natural growth suggest?
Yeah. So natural growth tends to be very, very parallel. So when you look at natural growth and you look at the upper jaw, you typically get between the ages of about 7 and the ages of about 26 years old, you typically get about 4 millimeters of width total. So about 2 millimeters of width increase on both sides of the maxilla from about 7 years old to 26 years old when growth is complete. In the mandible, you tend to get about 1 millimeter width increase, okay? So those are kind of like the baseline calculations that we look at. Where we want to end up is we want to have the maxilla 3 to 5 millimeters wider than the mandible. Why do we want that relationship? Well, if the maxilla is 3 to 5 millimeters wider than the mandible, then the maxillary teeth can be upright within the bone, the mandibular teeth can be upright within the bone, and the upper teeth can still fit on the outside of the lower teeth the way that they're designed. And if you look at prehistoric skulls, 500 plus years ago, that was almost always the case. Upper jaw about 3 to 5 millimeters wider than the lower jaw at the level of the first molars, and things tend to fit together really well. So the question you didn't ask, but one that we get a lot, is like, well, what if 3 to 5 millimeters isn't enough for me to breathe? Or maybe I want more expansion because I want a wider smile, or maybe I want my cheeks to be more prominent, or whatever it might be. There may be reasons why a patient would want, or maybe I have a lower jaw that's too small. Like maybe I don't want to only expand 3 to 5 millimeters bigger because I feel like my lower jaw is too small. Well, that's when you start to get into the realm of, okay, well, what are we going to do about then? So what are we going to do about that? So one thing is, you've probably heard of SFOT, or surgically facilitated orthodontic therapy, which is basically a surgical way to widen the lower jaw. And I'll say widen the lower jaw, but understand it's not true widening, like as if you cut the lower jaw in half. And yes, I am aware that there are procedures that do cut the lower jaw in half and actually widen the lower jaw. Those come with the risks of rotating condyles, which again is an unnatural form of expansion. That's not how the mandible grows. So you end up with a wider anterior portion than you do posterior portion. So We're not talking about that. SFOT just provides bone around the lower teeth, essentially. So it allows the lower teeth to translate buccally within the jaw, which essentially or effectively widens the lower arch. And if the lower arch is wider and supported by bone, well, now we can expand the upper arch more to go to the level of where that lower arch is. And so for patients who want expansion above and beyond the 3 to 5 millimeters wider than their current lower jaw, SFOT might be something worth looking into to move the lower teeth outward and still have them supported in bone. So you're not moving them outside of bone and causing recession and problems with the teeth. They can move outward, the arch can be wider, and that allows you to continue to expand the upper jaw. Or if you have a lower jaw that's set back, and you know you're going to advance that lower jaw surgically, or as of the last couple years, non-surgically, which is another big game changer. Maybe we'll get onto that in a future call. But about 2 years ago, Hugo de Klerk published some data on growing the lower jaw. And I say growing, but technically it's not growing, but it is lengthening the lower jaw. Essentially, they took a Herbst appliance, which postures the lower jaw forward, and they connected it to mini plates instead of connecting it to the teeth. And what that does is when you connect it to mini plates is that it puts all of the force on the anterior mandible itself. And when you put that force on the anterior mandible, it holds the lower jaw forward out of the jaw socket longer than it would if you put the force on the teeth, which move and then cause the jaw to move back. And I posted a video on this on my YouTube channel. So if that doesn't make any sense, go back to Vegas Orthodoc and look at like growing lower jaws or growing mandible, and you can watch the whole hour video on it. But basically, this allows the lower jaw to lengthen. So if you lengthen and or bring forward the lower jaw in some way, because the lower jaw is slightly V-shaped, meaning the further back on the lower jaw you get, the wider it becomes. So as you move the lower jaw forward, a wider portion of the lower jaw moves forward, whether you do that through the growth plates like I talked about, or the skeletal plates, or whether you do that through actual jaw surgery where they cut it and move it forward. Now a wider portion of the mandible is moving forward. So now you can widen the maxilla more to match with that wider portion of the maxilla. So if you're going to move your jaw forward, that gives you the ability to widen the maxilla more in order to get it to match.
Yeah, I mean, that's time's up. So I really do want to say thank you very much, Dr. J, for taking the time out of your day and telling us and giving us some insight on airway health and the FME.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for being here. Hey, thanks for being a part of this movement. And I really do feel like it is a movement. If it weren't for, patients who were interested in advancing this space, and of course, doctors and companies like Facegenics and others, Partners Dental Studio is another great partner. They're very invested in making the quality of expansion better as well. Like this wouldn't go anywhere. And so the fact that we can collaborate this way, I mean, this kind of collaboration, never really has happened in the past. So with modern technology, with the ability to connect with so many people, JP, you and your team, connecting providers. I mean, it really is a really neat time to be an orthodontist. Truthfully, I'm grateful for what I do every single day. So I appreciate you guys carving out the time to be a part of this. And again, anything I can do to help you guys, let me know. And I appreciate your interest. Keep it going. The more you guys research, the more you guys learn, the more conversations you have with providers in your area, the faster this will move forward. So keep up the good work.
We'll see you guys next time.
Take care.